All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I've got a little confession to begin with. I often do this. Um, I've gotten back into the habit of writing out my sermons. You'll probably catch me glancing over to my little script here. And it's funny when I write out a message, it's just really awkward to write the small talk that I usually engage in at the beginning of a message. It just reminds me how much I miss being with you, meeting as the church face to face, and I look forward to doing that again one day. But for now, let's wrestle with Job, just a really complex character. And I'm going to go to my notes. To put it mildly, Job is an interesting character, and a book. Depending on which theologian you talk to or you read, you'll get a variety of opinions about who Job was and how we should read this book. The setting of Job's story is in the land of Uz. This makes Job an Uzite. More significantly, Job is a non-Jew. In the same way, his family and friends that we encounter in the story have little or nothing to do with Jewish tradition or history. All of this gives the story a bit of a Middle-earth feel. One theory, one that I subscribe to, is that this is intentional. It's as though the context of historicity has been stripped away to reveal just the heart of the narrative. The book of Job also asks more questions than it answers. This is interesting, considering the fact that it is considered one of the biblical books of wisdom. And we'll get back to that in just a little bit. Job 1:1 says this: "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil." Now, this is quite a positive review. The first descriptors of Job as a man were that he was blameless and upright. He had no skeletons in his closet, living a life of integrity and high moral fiber. It's as though the recipe for his uprightness follows, saying that he feared God and he turned away from evil. Now, this wasn't someone's opinion or something that Job said about himself. This was the biblical profile of Job. As such, we're left to believe that there was literally nothing beneath the surface that was untoward, no secret sin left unfound. Now, this is important, and this brings us to our first point, and I've made 8 points. I know it's long, it's cumbersome, but these are really important truths about Job, his situation, and his faith. The first point is this: Job was blameless before God. This we know to be true. Verses 2-5 tell us a little bit more about Job's family. First, he was very well off. He had been blessed with wealth, livestock, and servants, described as the greatest of all the people in the East. And we see that in Job 1:3. So this brings us to our second truth about Job, that Job was very wealthy. Despite being a non-Jew, Job was known to worship the one true God. A point of curiosity was his practice of extra sacrifices on the off chance that someone in his household may have accidentally sinned against God. He was so reverent and careful in his worship that he didn't want to risk unrighteousness as a result of his children's carelessness when it came to worship. Then, the story changes abruptly to be in the courts of heaven, where God himself is interacting with those described as the sons of God. This included Satan. As an aside, the study of these things, or these beings being referred to as sons of God, is fascinating, but it's not essential to the teaching for today. God asks Satan where he's been. This question should raise our eyebrows because of what we know to be true about God. He is omniscient, and he would know exactly where Satan is coming from. So we can assume that God is in the driver's seat of this interaction. Satan essentially says he's been prowling all over the earth. God then follows up, asking if Satan happened to notice Job. God reiterates Job's bio, the parts about him being a blameless, upright, God-fearing man who turns away from evil. Well, Satan takes the bait and argues with God that Job is only devoted to God because God takes such good care of him. He complains that Job has lived in a bubble and has never lacked for faith because God has always provided for him. Satan then argues that if all of Job's things were stripped away, Job would not be as blameless, upright, or God-fearing. Well, God, knowing the heart of Job, agrees to allow Satan to do anything short of killing Job. The rest of Job 1 explains the depths to which Satan worked Job over. This brings us to our third point. God allows Satan to attack Job. And we're going to see it right here. Job 1:13-19 says this. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. And the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house. And it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. In a singular moment, Job's servants, 500 oxen, 500 donkeys were slaughtered. His servants and 7,000 sheep were consumed in fire. His servants and 3,000 camels were butchered, and his 7 sons and 3 daughters were crushed by their windblown house. See, Satan had argued that Job's faithfulness hinged on his stuff. God knew there was more to it. This was the moment under the microscope, and Job's response declared a winner in this debate. It says this in Job 1:20-22. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. You see, Job's first response made some sense. He was visibly anguished as he mourned and grieved his loss. This tells us that the people and livestock that he lost were important to him. He cared deeply about losing them. But he put his grief into context with his next statements. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. In other words, everything Job owned and loved was a gift from God. Moreover, everything ultimately belonged to God. This brings us to point 4. Job's faith did not fail. Well, let's pause here for a second. We've all been blessed. James 1:17 tells us every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. You may look around and notice that some people have more good and more perfect gifts than others. But the point of this exercise is to take stock of the fact that you have been blessed. I have been blessed. Right now, I'd love for you to make some time for you to get out paper and pen and take inventory of all God's gifts in your life. If you want to go ahead and grab those things, I'll tell you a quick story. This week, Emily, our youngest, turned 16 years old. She was showered with some really thoughtful gifts from friends and family. One gift was especially interesting, though. Miley and David bought Ems a kind of a journal. It was a journal of lists. You may have heard of it before. I hadn't. More specifically, it was a journal of making lists. The list topics were there for Emily to ponder, and a little teaching follows each list to advise her regarding what she should do with that list. In some cases, she was encouraged to connect and be thankful to those who contributed to the joy that came from that list. It's an interesting exercise in taking stock. This brings us to our 5th point. God has blessed us. If we believe what the Bible tells us, every good and perfect thing that you can think of and take stock of is a gift from God. It was his to give, and he chose to give it to you. While this is valuable to understand, there's another part to this exercise. If you've created a list, start to make note of the things on your list that are eternal. Now, before you go too far down the bunny trail, let's take this exercise back to Job for a second. Job had many servants. He had hundreds of oxen and donkeys. He had thousands of camels and sheep. He had 10 children. Let's be clear. None of these gifts from God were eternal. You see, when the reports started to come in about the slaughter of his oxen and donkeys, the burning of his sheep and the butchering of his camels, his servants suffering these same fates, and then when Job lost his 10 children, their lives had come to an end. God's gifts to Job were perfect, but they were never permanent. In chapter 2, Satan is given permission to amp up the torment. He goes after Job's health. It's as Job sits in a pile of ashes, scraping his open sores with a broken piece of pottery, that we're introduced to some helpful people in Job's life. Job's lovely wife takes the direct approach. She says, "Curse God and die." This was her kindly advice. Some of Job's friends, widely regarded as wise, began to reason with Job. Their approach was a little more logical, suggesting that the fix for all of this would be to admit the sin in his life so that God could forgive him and remove this curse on his life. But Job holds true to his convictions. He contends for his own blamelessness and wrestles with his own understanding of why this would be happening to him. Job 3 to 37, so chapters 3 to 37, give us some dense, weighty Hebrew poetry that acts out the arguments between Job and his so-called friends. Each of them has their own theories as to the why behind the afflictions that Job is suffering. Earlier I mentioned that Job is one of the books in the collection we call the Books of Wisdom. 3 of these books in particular form a series that acknowledges, engages, and wrestles with God's sovereign wisdom. The book of Proverbs is comfort food to most of us. Even for those outside of the Christian faith, the premise of Proverbs gives us a framework for justice that just feels fair. In a proverbial universe, every good deed gets rewarded and no bad deed goes unpunished. It's the Disney ending we all love. And it's the framework from which Job's friends are rationalizing Job's suffering. Job's friends insisted that his suffering was a consequence for his sins. Job contended that he was blameless, so this couldn't be true. This led to Job's own wonderings about who God is and how his system of justice actually works. That was beautiful. I had to pause for that bird. I don't know if you could hear it, but it was quite nice. Moving on from the book of Proverbs, another book of wisdom, the book of Ecclesiastes, offers some insight into the truth that we know today. Sometimes good things happen to bad people, and sometimes good people suffer. Ecclesiastes also reminds us of the fact that people come and they go. The march of time gets us all. It's a bit of a downer, to say the least, but it reminds us that we are finite beings. It says we're like vapor. Where Proverbs gives us this clear cause and effect world that sees the industrious rewarded and the foolish punished, Ecclesiastes tells us that there is a randomness to life that is undeniable. So now we've got Job. The book of Job, we get introduced to a man who's been greatly blessed by God. He's got everything a person could ever want. And we're made comfortable knowing that there's something behind his blessings. He's blameless, upright, and God-fearing. His blessings are the proverbial reward for his righteousness. But then he's stricken with tragedy. His friends offer proverbial wisdom that isn't quite a fit. Now, church, I may be the only one, but I know that I'm guilty of looking for a proverbial answer in ecclesiastical world. One of my greatest shortcomings is that I confuse counseling with problem solving. I look for the logical fix when sometimes the world is clearly illogical. So we see Job's suffering, and the only reason for it is a wager between Satan and God. So let's stop there for a second and clear something up. If you'll remember the beginning of this message, we talked about the broad variety of theological examinations of this book of Job. Herein lies one of the reasons for believing that the book of Job is not an historical account of a man named Job. While this isn't a parable, a fictitious, relatable story told to teach a point, the story of Job is more parable than it is historical. As such, it should be understood that God is not hanging out with Satan, making bets about you today. That's important. But that brings us to our next point. This is point 6, that we will experience suffering. Most of the book of Job is the story of suffering. Job's grief and anguish is understandable when you consider all that he's lost. But Job isn't only grieving the loss of loved ones and livestock. He's grieving the loss of a sense of innocence. The simplicity of living well and being blessed by God has been dealt a blow. And Job is left wondering about God himself. But through it all, Job maintains his posture of uprightness and righteousness. He stays right with God. But when Job gets a little too demanding about wanting to know what is going on, God's response puts things back into perspective. Job 38 starts like this. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" Chapter 39 goes on to ask some very intimate questions about mountain goats giving birth, the calving of does, the wildness of donkeys, oxen and ostriches, horses and hawks. The questions are rhetorical, knowing full well Job doesn't have the answer to any of these questions, because he's not God. In the end, Job is left with his mouth hanging open, just speechless. Well, not completely speechless, because he says this. He says, "Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further." You can find that in Job 40, verses 4 and 5. This brings us to point number 7. Remember, there's only 8 points. We're getting there, people. Point 7 is this: where will we turn when we suffer? Now, you might find yourself a little incredulous right now. On the surface, Job deserves better for his faith. He's lived a blameless, upright, God-fearing life. In return, he's lost his livestock and loved ones. In the world's economy of justice, it's God who has some explaining to do. But if we relive Job's initial response to his sufferings, we remember that Job saw every good gift as coming from the Father. He acknowledges that he entered the world with nothing and would leave the world with nothing. You see, Job wasn't under the illusion that the blessings he enjoyed were because he had earned them with righteousness. This is where Disney can get it wrong sometimes. If we can understand this truth, that we aren't blessed because we deserve to be blessed, then suffering can also take on a different tone. Sometimes life is proverbial. Sometimes we suffer because we're foolish or evil. But sometimes suffering has nothing to do with our righteousness or our behavior. This is where the rubber meets the road. When we look back at the heroes of the faith that we've been studying, Noah, Abraham, Joseph, Ruth, David, and now Job, we can see this consistent trait of faith. Noah had faith in God even before it rained. Abraham had faith in God even before God made him a nation. Joseph had faith in God even from jail. Ruth had faith in God even in widowhood. David had faith in God even in the face of a giant. Satan had had accused Job of having faith in his stuff, and God proved that Job's faith was in him. Our circumstances can change in an instant. If we're going to have faith, it needs to be in something or someone who is unchanging. Okay, that's some weighty stuff. And earlier I said that God's gifts were perfect, but they're not permanent. This can seem like blasphemy when we're worshiping the gifts. But the truth is that only God is both perfect and permanent. This word permanent and what it means are really important. If you're old enough to remember the game called Perfection, you'll remember the stress of working the puzzle as the timer ticked down before all your work exploded. If the puzzle was simply a stationary board where you're matching shapes, the game board's permanence allows you to work calmly and patiently. But the impermanence of the board, knowing that it could pop up at any time, creates a heightened level of anxiety. As a game, this is fun. In life, not so much. When we put our faith in things that could change in an instant, we're playing a dangerous game. We build chairs out of materials that are relatively permanent. This way we can have a reasonable level of faith that the chair will hold us when we sit down on it. But when we build chairs out of styrofoam and balsa wood, we'd be foolish to put our faith in it. This brings us to our final point, number 8. We should be confident in what we put our faith in. We should be confident in what we put our faith in. Ultimately, the more permanent something is, the more reasonable it is to put our trust and faith in it. When Job loses his livestock and loved ones, he learns a hard lesson about their impermanence. When God speaks to Job, questioning him about where he was when the earth was formed, we learn something about the permanence of God. When God speaks to Job, questioning him about where he was when the earth was formed, we learn something about the permanence of God. His eternal nature makes him the ultimate candidate for our unwavering faith. But just as God is permanent, he's also not subject to our timing and demands. He alone is sovereign. Our role is to trust him and to have faith. Let's pray. Father, forgive us for many things. Right now I'm reminded of the times where I've put my faith in things. And when I've worked so hard to accumulate things and build up stores that I can put my faith in so that I can feel comfort and have some peace. Lord, the passage in Job where you are asking these rhetorical questions about where Job was could be asked of us. I wonder, I know I wasn't there when you formed the earth, when you started it all, when you laid out plans, when you planned out not just my life, but the lives of mountain goats and oxen and horses and hawks. Lord, you are sovereign, you are omniscient, and you are Lord of all. Forgive me for when I get distracted from someone, you, who deserves my faith, my wholehearted trust. Help me to get back on that right path of trusting you first above all. In Jesus' name, amen. So here's the takeaway for today. It's so easy to fall into the trap of putting our faith in things that are impermanent. We want to be healthy, so we give our time and energy to exercise and nutrition. We want to be secure, so we work hard to build stores of money. These aren't necessarily bad, but they are impermanent. In a heartbeat, our health and wealth can fail us. If we want to put our faith into something genuinely unshakable, we can only look in one direction, and that's God. The one who laid the foundations of the earth is the immutable or unchanging rock that we can cling to in the wildest storms. So my advice, sow into your relationship with him. Sure, go out for a run and watch what you eat and develop a financial savings plan, but grow your relationship with God. Savor the opportunities to know Him better and watch your faith grow. I pray that your faith will grow this week, that you'll find ways to deepen your relationship with Him. Until next week, we'll see you later.